would suggest to you is that Roman crucifixions were ritualized public performances of punitive violence, intended as instruments of state terror and enacted as a prolonged spectacle of execution torture, frequently involving sexualized violence. And if we had a lot more time, we could unpack probably some of the key elements in that compressed statement of what I would see crucifixions to be. But just to pull out some of the key features, my research over the last 15 years into crucifixion as a torture practice and as a punitive form of sexualized violence is more or less summed up in that sentence. It reflects my belief that the attentive study of torture practices, past and present, can illuminate both historical understanding and theological reflection upon the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. So my methodological approach, I suppose, shaped by Latin American liberation theology, has been to work from a current situation of injustice and oppression, and the violence associated with that, the political violence under authoritarian regimes and dictatorships in Latin America during the 1970s and 80s particularly, and to use that grounded research in torture practices for an exploration of crucifixion as a form of torture. And one of the things I noticed in that process was how prevalent sexualized violence was in torture practices, not just in Latin America, I suspect, but worldwide. Very, very common in organized torture practices is an element of sexualized violence, and that begs the question as to why that's the case. And that's really what I wanted to draw upon in a rereading of the gospel accounts of crucifixion. Clearly an event and narratives very much at the heart of the Christian message, but very much neglected, it seems to me, in terms of any sustained reading of them in light of torture practices. So my hope has been to present a new reading of crucifixion which better identifies crucifixion as a form of state terror, a necessary foundation point for really understanding the direction of this argument. The crucifixion wasn't just an execution of an individual, but it was a political act of intimidation by a state power, often in effect an imperial or state power, against a subject people, where the object of crucifixion was not just the immediate victim, but the subject population, who were also both witnesses and in some ways subjected to this violence. But in this context of understanding it as a form of state terror, not just execution, to recognise more explicitly the sexualised violence that was often part of it. And then also in my work to try and address the silence which has surrounded this for nearly 2 millennia. Why is it that such, what I would claim to be a central part of crucifixion, has been almost entirely written out of the Christian story? So it's the silence element as well as, I suppose, the substantive element that I'm interested in. Now, if you're at all interested in this, there's an article available for download in PDF, which is where I first set out the basic arguments around state terror and sexual violence back in 1999. I won't summarise the whole thing here, but I suppose one of the key things I try to do is draw attention to the threefold stripping of Jesus identifiable in gospel accounts of the Passion narrative. I also point to the possible further violence that may have been committed against Jesus in the Praetorium. In the gospel stories, there's a point where Jesus is taken away after he's been sentenced into the Roman Praetorium by the Roman guards, and there are stories of the abuse that he was subjected to, but it is, in the light of more recent torture practices, surprisingly benign abuse. He is called names, he is slapped, it is a strange account, I think, which I suggest may be covering up further abuse that we're not told about. One of the points I make in the article is there's a slightly strange point in Mark's Gospel where it's mentioned that the whole cohort is called together for this abuse. Now, a whole cohort is 600 to 800 men, and that suggests it's a much more deliberate, systematic form of abuse than we might think of as just a few bad apples or a few rogue soldiers doing something informal. It suggests to me a more systematic and structured form of abuse. But ultimately we don't know. We never will know what goes on what went on in the Praetorium. But what we do know, at least what we have written in the Gospel accounts and what makes perfect sense in terms of what we know of Roman crucifixion practice, was the enforced nakedness of the cross. And yet this enforced nakedness is typically absent from the Christian imagination and from Christian art. It can in fact come as a bit of a shock to see exceptions to it, rare as they are, such as this image of naked crucifix by the 15th century Florentine artist Donatello. Or this 20th century image by Eric Gill, somewhat more abstract. The evidence that I think supports the fact that this was in fact the case in the crucifixion of Jesus would be that it is clearly indicated, perhaps not absolutely explicitly stated in the Gospels that Jesus was naked, but piecing together the casting of lots for his clothes and for his undergarment, that I think is pretty clear in the Gospel accounts. It also fits with what is known of customary practice in Roman crucifixions. It would have been exceptional, at least from what we read, if Jesus was not naked on the cross. And then thirdly, there are early Christian writings, for example, one by Augustine, that supports this. So Augustine in City of God 16:2 talks about Noah's shameful nakedness when asleep drunk, which is a reference to Genesis 9:20-25, as prefiguring Christ's humiliation in the Passion. I think the quote there is, "The Passion of Christ, which was signified by that man Noah's nakedness." So a clear linking, it seems, at least in the mind of Augustine, from the nakedness of Christ in the Passion to the nakedness of Noah. More recently, though, my research has been going on from that. So the early research was around the enforced exposure of nakedness on the cross and the silence and uncertainty around exactly what happened in the Praetorium. More recently, I've been looking at the historical relationship between crucifixion and impalement, a relationship which I think has been given far too little attention. And I say this because the standard take on impalement and crucifixion, the tracing of crucifixion as a punishment practice in antiquity, is that it evolved out of impalement, but under the Romans it took a different form, where instead of impalement, it was being nailed or hung on the cross, and the impalement side drops out of it. I think that's probably naive. It reflects far too benign a sense of what the Romans were about as a supposedly civilized people, and a failure to understand that crucifixion was intended to maximize, not minimize, the horror of the execution. What I'm suggesting, I suppose, is portrayed here in a 17th century image by Robert Knox, reflecting, it seems, on executions he had apparently witnessed in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was then, which shows how a figure could be both impaled and crucified. These are not mutually exclusive alternatives. They can go together. The execution on a stake image might, I think, make us more attentive to references in the ancient literature which suggest this was precisely the case with crucifixion. For example, Seneca's account of crucifixion in his letter to Marcia on Consolation. He's writing here from what he had seen personally in Bithynia at about 40 CE, so more or less the same time, or within a decade of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in Palestine. Seneca writes, "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground, some impale their private parts, others stretch out their arms on the crossbeam." And we're quite familiar in Christian art from the third of those categories, the arms stretched out on the crossbeam. We don't, I think, pay any attention to the types of crucifixions which impale the private parts. We do perhaps know of some tradition of people being crucified with head down towards the ground. So I suspect much more work needs to be done to investigate the relationship between impalement practices and crucifixion, and to challenge the sense that these are exclusive of each other. For us this afternoon, though, I want to focus on a slightly different part of my work, which draws on research into lynching, particularly in southern US states, and adds a further dimension to what I think might be going on in the violence of crucifixion. This work draws on my reading into ritual studies and what's often involved in ritual practices. And after exploring that in a bit more detail, I'm going to talk a little bit about Justin Martyr and his insight into the comparison of the cross of the Passover lamb or the Paschal lamb and the cross of Jesus of Nazareth. So, first, some thoughts on crucifixion, ritual and violence. My interest in torture as ritualised violence draws especially on William Kavanagh's book, Torture and Eucharist, addressing torture practices in Chile during the Pinochet era. Kavanagh's insightful account of torture and his description of torture as, quote, perverse liturgy is a fascinating and provocative treatment, and I can do no more than touch upon it here. Kavanagh invites us to see torture as a symbol-laden and ritualistic display of destructive power against the individual victim and the wider social body. In Kavanagh's words, "I will display torture as a central rite in the liturgy by which the Chilean state manifested its power." So it's a fascinating way of looking at state power exercised through torture as a form of ritual and liturgy. He presents political instruments of punishment and state terror. He presents torture as a political instrument of punishment and state terror, rather than limiting his analysis to torture as a means of interrogation and extraction of supposed truths for intelligence purposes. And this, I think, is a very helpful approach to understanding crucifixion as a form of torture execution and its use by the Romans. The Romans did not use crucifixion as a form of extracting information. It wasn't that type of torture. It was punitive torture. And it had a much wider context in terms of its purpose. Many of the racial lynchings in the southern states of the US illustrate a similar point on the use of punitive torture. And racial lynchings did not just happen in a random way. They were very often shaped by a shared pattern of steps and procedures, in similar ways as Kavanagh traces for Chilean torture as ritual. In some cases, there were reports of victims being tortured for hours before finally being killed in the lynching. So, both torture and lynchings point to the significance of ritualised practice, and I would suggest that attention to this ritual element is also important for understanding crucifixion. Some of the more horrific and macabre aspects of US lynchings, many of which involve sexualised violence as part of the execution, and again I'll suggest this sexualised violence is an element of lynching which has largely been excluded from people's awareness. Not entirely, it's there in the literature, but as a general rule, people don't focus on the sexual violence of lynching. But being aware of it, for me at least, suggests a further disturbing question. And that is it possible that the executioners had a more explicitly religious dimension to their actions? I don't think there's any real argument that lynchings and torture practices involve a ritual dimension in terms of repeated pattern, routine of acts with some symbolic meaning. In terms of that broad inclusive sense of ritual, I think it's absolutely right, and Kavanagh offers a very persuasive account that torture is to be seen as a ritual practice. But I want to push that argument on a little bit further and ask, well, is it possible they also had a ritual dimension in terms of a more explicit religious sense? To give one example, one of the motivations behind the mutilation of the body in US lynchings, it seems, and this includes the practice of genital mutilation, may have been a desire to both dehumanise and desecrate the victim, but also to destroy the life of the victim and strike at the memory that others had of the victim. Mutilations were a physical and symbolic way to transform the victim's body in ways seen as so damaging to human dignity that it made it hard to remember the victim without this sense of stigma and shame. So you could actually rob the family and followers of the torture victim, you could rob them of the memory of that person by making it really difficult for them to remember that person in a dignified way. And one of the ways to do that would be to dehumanise and desecrate. So a ritual of desecration actually makes sense in terms of what torturers and executioners are doing. And it seems to me that crucifixions were likewise intended to dehumanise their victims. That's what crucifixion was really about. Is it then not possible they were intended to desecrate their victims? In a world that was much more willing to see religious significance in what might now be seen as essentially secular actions, it's worth asking whether the Roman executioners at the cross might have understood some religious, or perhaps we'd better phrase it, anti-religious dimension to their actions. Might they have perceived crucifixion as enacting a destructive spiritual dimension, an inverted and perverse liturgy, to use Kavanagh's term, of degradation and desecration? Well, Josephus describes Roman crucifixions during the siege of Jerusalem, so this would be another 40 years on, about 70 CE, as, quote, like a grim joke. Might the Romans crucifying Jesus, who were familiar with ritual sacrifice, imagine the blood of crucifixion during the festival of Passover as an ironic parody of animal sacrifice and Passover rituals? We know that Christian writers, of course, could link the cross with the blood of sacrifice as a form of reverence. This is almost so firmly linked, we almost have to remind ourselves that this is something of a jump. To jump from the execution of a human victim on a cross to a lamb being sacrificed is a huge imaginative leap. But we're very familiar with it in Christian tradition, so we perhaps don't think it's so odd to think of the executed body of Christ as a sacrificial lamb. Is it possible that the Roman executioners could, as a joke, have had something similar in mind? Reading the torture of testimony survivors today, one of the themes that sometimes comes out is the self-aggrandizing claims of the torturers
who saw themselves as like God, and said things like, "In here I am God." It's easy to see how a torturer's sense of their omnipotence relative to the powerlessness of the victim can fuel this hubristic delusion of power. If torturers can come to see their control over life and death in divine terms, it's not, to my mind at least, such a stretch to imagine that they might have understood what they were doing in this religious, anti-religious sense. It might have been a way of them displaying this hubristic power. So, to draw my points from this first part of the presentation, what am I suggesting? First, that studies of past and present tortures and lynchings can contribute to a better awareness of the ritualised dimension to torture, lynching and executions. Second, that in some contexts, this ritualistic dimension can involve the dehumanisation and desecration of the victim. Third, that this may open up new avenues for thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth as an act of ritualistic desecration by his executioners, an anti-sacrifice. And fourth, elements of sexualised violence in crucifixion might have been a key part of this. So with that framework in mind, I want to explore the possibility in the next section by examining sacrifice and the preparation of the Passover or Paschal lamb, and then in the third part to take this into relationship with some of the work of René Girard. So, the sacrifice and preparation of the Passover lamb. The conduct of Passover, or regulations that prescribe what should happen in Passover, are offered in Deuteronomy 16. An unblemished lamb or goat was slaughtered at dusk on 14th of the month, 14th Nisan, to be eaten that night, 15th Nisan. That's Deuteronomy 16:6, along with unleavened bread. In Jesus' day, the animal had to be killed in the temple in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would therefore fill with pilgrim visitors from throughout the land coming to Jerusalem to make sacrifice and have the Passover meal. It seems that, not surprisingly, for a variety of practical reasons, pilgrim families would band together to share the sacrifice and the Passover meal, and after arriving in Jerusalem, one or two of the men from a particular band would take the animal to the temple for the sacrifice, for it to be ritually slaughtered. Immediately after the slaughter, the animals were hung on hooks along the temple walls or columns to allow for the draining of blood, some of which was collected and passed forward so it might reach the altar. The animal was then taken out of the temple to be roasted whole in a clay oven before being shared amongst those who had brought it. The whole animal was roasted, including the head and innards. And to do this, the animals were spitted. From this brief description, it's hardly surprising that early Christian writers would make the connection between the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb and the crucifixion of Jesus. The timing of events, of course, invited such comparisons. The blood of the lamb and the blood of Jesus would also have provided a dramatic visual link. Anyone who was familiar with the Passover lambs in the temple and the blood of crucifixion, not that crucifixion as such was a particularly bloody act, but the whipping and scourging of the victim before they were put on the cross made it a very bloody act, would have been able, I think, to make this connection. And it helps explain why Jesus' death would have been presented as a form of sacrifice, would have been understood in this way, with Jesus presented as the Lamb of God. But I think what gets missed in this is the skewering of the sacrificial lamb. In an extraordinary passage, the early Christian apologist Justin Martyr, in his Dialogue with Trypho, section 40, describes the Paschal lamb as being on a cross. Justin writes, "For the lamb which is roasted and dressed up in the form of a cross. For one spit is transfixed right through from the lower parts up to the head, and one across the back, to which are attached the legs of the lamb." In Justin's eyes, it seems that the ways that the lambs were dressed and roasted on the spit prefigures the crucifixion of Jesus. Joseph Tabary has a fascinating discussion in his article Jewish Quarterly Review on this largely neglected passage. He points out that Justin Martyr lived in the 2nd century CE, and according to the church historian Eusebius, the dialogue with Trypho occurred in Ephesus. Trypho is portrayed as a refuge from the Bar Kokhba revolt, so about 132 to 135 CE, and the dialogue can be dated to about this time. So we have a 2nd century, relatively early 2nd century dialogue. Now, this means that Justin was living after the destruction of the temple, 70 CE, so he could not have been a direct witness of how the lambs were prepared. He doesn't tell us how he knows that this was Jewish practice in the temple period. And Tabary notes that there is some evidence that despite the loss of the temple, some Jews may have continued to make the sacrifice despite prohibitions from rabbis that they should no longer do so. So after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, sacrificial practice was, according to the rabbis, something that shouldn't happen. It should only happen in the temple. There wasn't a temple. There should therefore be no animal sacrifice. But it's possible that some Jews disregarded what their religious leaders told them and continued to make sacrifices. That's possible, but Justin himself says that Jews no longer offered the sacrifice. So it seems that Justin is not thinking along those lines. An obvious alternative, is that Justin simply projected back the cross shape of the spit onto the lamb from the crucifixion of Jesus because of his theological convictions. If he was convinced that Jesus was the Passover lamb, then it makes sense perhaps to assume that the lambs were sacrificed on a cross. So in effect arguing Jesus was placed on a cross, the death of Jesus mirrored the death of the Paschal Lamb, therefore the Paschal Lamb must have been placed on a cross. This is possible, but the intention behind it is the opposite. He wants to argue in the opposite direction, that Christ's death on the cross makes more sense in light of the Paschal Lamb. We understand that the cross of Christ in light of the cross of the Paschal Lamb, not vice versa. So it would be rather strange, at least if he was aware of the circularity of his argument. A third alternative is that Justin was familiar with Samaritan Passover practice, and the Samaritans continued to sacrifice the Paschal Lamb even when this had ended in Judaism. And Tabary, who writes the article, believes that this is most likely, and therefore spends quite a lot of time in the article trying to explain certain discrepancies between Justin's account and reports on Samaritan customs in more recent times, because we're in a position where we have anthropologists and other observers who've been able to observe Samaritan practice. A significant article by Moulton in 1903 and by Jeremias in 1932. And so what Tabary wants to do is show that Justin was familiar with Samaritan practice, and the discrepancies which have been identified between recent Samaritan practice and how Justin describes it are to be explained by changes which have happened in Samaritan practice. Now, this is significant because one of the key differences in practice that Tabary points out is that Justin speaks of the spit being inserted from the anus to the mouth, whereas the Mishnah, the Jewish law, describes a wooden spit being inserted from mouth to anus. Tabary notes that 20th century Samaritan practice is also a wooden spit from mouth to anus. But to reconcile this with Justin's knowledge of Samaritan practice, he argues that it's possible it was originally the other way round, but this changed at a later date. If Tabary is correct, and if Justin was aware of Samaritan practice of his day, then this would explain the discrepancy between his account and the Mishnah. However, what Tabary doesn't consider, and what I would suggest, is a fourth alternative, which would also explain the discrepancy and allow that Justin was correct on the spit and quite possibly even the crossbeam, not just the fact the lamb was on a skewer, on a spit, but this was in the shape of the cross. And that would be that his description of the spit going from anus to mouth, rather than vice versa, is his assumption based on what he had seen of crucifixions. His statement of knowledge of how victims of crucifixion were impaled is then the crucial part for him, which he then assumes the Paschal Lamb would have been spitted in the same way. And to my mind at least, this is a more straightforward explanation of the discrepancy than Tabary's suggestion that practice may have changed. Whatever the case may have been on the dressing and roasting of the Paschal Lamb in Jesus' day, Justin's words are the most direct evidence that I have come across from an early Christian source, which reflects the possibility that crucifixion of Jesus involved impalement, and that this violence had an overtly sexual element. If this is right, then the idea that the Roman executioners of Jesus may have enjoyed a grim joke at their victims' expense, in which they saw his cross as similar to the crosses, or at least the spits, that transfixed the Passover lambs being roasted throughout the city, is not as far-fetched, I would suggest, as might first appear. Here's a picture of 3 lambs skewered and in effect on crosses. I don't think it's such a huge leap visually from that picture of 3 lambs from the 3 victims on the 3 crosses. It's not as strange looking at it that way as just thinking of the idea in an abstract way might be. And therefore, Justin's description of how the cross worked, in effect, projects impalement and sexual violence on the Paschal Lamb and links Jesus' crucifixion to that. Now, nothing that I have said so far is dependent on a distinctively Christian, on a distinctively Girardian reading. Rather, I've offered it as an interpretation of crucifixion shaped by a reading of human rights reports, Truth Commission documents, and other accounts of torture, lynching and violence as executions. So, in this next part of the paper, what I'm hoping to do is just share a few thoughts on where we might look to in Girard for further stimulus for investigation. I'm no expert in Girard, so I offer these more as questions with the hope that those of you who know much more than I do will be able to tell me whether these are blind alleys or might be worth exploring further. And I'll frame them around what I find the very helpful structure that Mike mentions in his book, and Arpad, I think you touched on this, and Paul as well, in terms of some of Girard's key ideas. The notion of desire as mimetic, linked particularly to his first book, the scapegoat mechanism as the regulation of mimetic rivalry in the second book, and the gospel revelation that exposes the hidden scapegoating mechanism and renders it ineffective in the third book. Taking these in turn, first, mimesis and imitation. Girard's work on mimesis focuses on the unconscious, or at least not fully conscious, dynamics of imitation and rivalry that give rise to violence and which societies seek to manage with scapegoating. My suggestion that the Roman executioners may have enacted further violence on Jesus that was part of some grim imitation of the Passover ritual around them is not a straightforward example of this. It's too much, I think, at a conscious level. But it may still be worth considering in terms of mimesis and imitation and what else might have been going on at a less conscious level. Secondly, scapegoating and the violence of sacrifice. Girard calls attention to the violent impulses that underlie religious sacrifice. It's easy to spiritualise and sanitise religious sacrifice in ways that obscure the blood and violence. Girard challenges us to see this differently. Framing the crucifixion of Christ in terms of the sacrifice of a lamb might seem to encourage a soft and woolly view of the cross. More so in this image, Christ, our Passover lamb. What could be more lovely? The actual practice was much more violent, and Girard encourages us to remember this. Third, finally, and very briefly, Girard invites us to recognise how truth can be hidden and forgotten, and how we can deceive ourselves into false beliefs that distance us from reality and prevent us from knowing truth. And that is what I think areas of contact with Girard's work may raise more questions than answers, at least in terms of what I can offer. And I'm not going to say more about them right now. Instead, I want to end by answering a slightly different question, which is the practical relevance of pursuing these questions at all. It's a question I'm often asked, or have been since publishing that first article, and I think it needs to be taken seriously and deserves an appropriate answer. Recent research by the Christian development agency Tear Fund on Collins as the social institution that has most potential to help them. Yet the same research also indicates that in practice, many churches do little, if anything, to address their needs. This is not, the research suggests, because the churches are unaware of the problem of sexualised violence in conflict. The churches are aware of it. It is seen as a social issue, but not a theological matter, and therefore not a central concern for the church. So what I would suggest is that acknowledgement of crucifixion as a sophisticated form of sexualised violence and humiliation might lead to a new conversation on how sexualised violence can be remembered in an imaginative ritual way that is to make a significant contribution to the healing and recovery of those who look to the church for practical help and pastoral support. So I would hope that the inquiries into crucifixion that I'm offering are not just part of creating an accurate historical record about the past, but they have a practical application in the present and for the future.
To me, there may be a link there with what I think is a kind of aesthetic for Girard in terms of literature. He talks about the figura, the typology of the victim, and that's, in a sense, he's going back to kind of patristic ways of reading scripture. You mentioned several examples there, and Noah's nakedness prefigures Christ's nakedness, and something there about if Girard's doing anything, he's simply saying this victim is connected with every other victim that there has been. But in order to understand that, you have to see the figura, you have to see the type. So I think that's another kind of area that could be explored a bit further. But again, that's the opposite of the Romans' use of spectacle as a way of subjugating, of expressing dominance and so on. But there's a whole lot of ambiguities around there about the looking. When does that looking become oppressive? When does it become part of the violation? So there's a few things there that could be taken from.
That's very, very helpful. So, would Girard just see Jesus as a figura, or is that a more generic term? Is that one he reserves for for the figure of Christ, or is that any archetypal figure? Which one do you happen to know?
Yeah, he is the lamb slain. He's the lamb slain since the foundation of the world. So Jesus is present in every victim, and he talks a lot about Oedipus, for example, and he sees Oedipus as somebody who's been victimized, and he refers at one point to the Byzantine ritual of Oedipus, the Passion of Oedipus, and he gets so excited when he says, "Oh, Passion of Oedipus!" Somebody's recognizing Oedipus as a Christ figure, and that's what this figural way of reading does. You see the Christian implications shining through every kind of victim situation. So somehow Jesus is the victim with a capital V, and everyone else shares in that victimhood, but he aligns himself with every victim that's ever been. But there's something, as the term implies, the figure is something about seeing the icon, the visualization, which has its own set of dynamics and problems, I think.
On another slant, there are a number of North African female academics who have looked at the whole denial of sexual violence in terms of politically driven or political groups with a paramilitary or political ideology, which may be worth looking at. Their whole thesis there is that these men are prepared to sacrifice themselves for the cause, but that one of the secrets that remains unspoken about is the burden that women from those traditions carry, especially around being misused with sexual violence. It was a theme that came up when I was in the victims forum here, and it's probably a theme that is yet to come out. Well, it is a theme that's yet to come out here. How paramilitary ideology or paramilitary groups have not been prepared to acknowledge violence done against women from their tradition, and the silence of women from that tradition, with a number of exceptions, because of the real threat of them facing real violence. So I think the whole theme of sacrifice, certain forms of talking about sacrifice, enabling things to be hidden, is very important, and it's actually very relevant here. But there's a lot of silence around it, and even in the victims forum it was mentioned but not able to be taken up because people are very vulnerable.
Could you specify that a little bit more? What kind of things could you see that would be a sense of healing for people who have been victims?
I think it needs to be done with some care. It's not to rush into it, but the potential. Picking up Mike's comment that in the victimhood of Jesus, you see you see an identity with others who are the victims. So to see Christ's presence in other victims, I think, is potentially a message of healing. Thinking about this Tear Fund report, what comes out in that is the sense of alienation and isolation, whereby the suffering of victims of sexualised violence seem to be experiencing that as being in their own world, cut off from the church, who just doesn't want to know, doesn't see this as theologically significant, and doesn't engage with it as a result. Now, if the worldwide churches could recognise those victims as the broken, abused figures of Christ in our day, then that should certainly challenge how they orientate their pastoral practice, and it might be of some psychological comfort to the victims themselves. I do think it would be very naive to assume that all victims will necessarily find that comforting. There may be some people who say, well, how does it help me to know this also happened to Jesus of Nazareth? There'll be cultural issues in terms of that might well make more sense for church practice in a predominantly Christian culture, or locally or nationally. I'm not sure that you would readily prescribe that in a culture. And one of the issues which came up with the Abu Ghraib situation, where people identified some of the figures in the images from Abu Ghraib as like Christ, as whether that was appropriate in terms of the figures themselves were Muslims. So what's going on to make those links? But in terms of a Christian context where people identify themselves as Christian, I do think there is potential for healing in a fuller understanding of what Christ suffered, but also an understanding that God did not abandon Christ. I mean, I think one of the elements I would pick up on this is a reading of the gospel narrative where whatever happened to Christ on the cross, God did not turn away and abandon Christ. Whereas my feeling is, in some ways, the Christian churches have abandoned that side of Christ's experience. That they haven't wanted to know about it. They've put it away and leave it hidden, which I think is pretty indicative of how often victims of sexualised violence are treated. It's something people don't want to know about. That is in turn internalised, and people feel that shame themselves. It's as if they feel, well, the churches don't want to know us, perhaps even God doesn't want to know me. There are some testimonies which suggest the internal sense of shame is so strong. It's as if you feel distant from God, as if God has turned away. Now, one thing I think about the gospel narrative is that God does not turn away. And that might also be something to explore in terms of healing dimensions of this.
Okay, thanks.
There's a kind of psychoanalytic reading that jumps out, but since we know that psychoanalysis is rubbish, it's difficult, but anyway, so anyway, I can try to think it through. So the psychoanalytic reading, of course, would be that sexualized violence performed by religious institutional figures itself then is a kind of perverse re-emergence of a sacrality. So it's a kind of tribute to the repressed knowledge of sexualized violence as exhibited in the crucifixion death of Jesus Christ that's performed perversely on new innocent victims. It's
I'm not sure that's where I would take it. I'll take it one step back from that a difficulty which Christian tradition has had in terms of a mature discussion of these issues gets expressed in different ways. So one expression is, well, we've just not been able to talk to this thing at all. As a result of that, we've not, in the discussion around clerical abuse, made what, to my mind, certainly in the light of this research, is a hugely obvious connection between the victims of clerical abuse and Christ, the victim. I mean, of all the discussion around clerical abuse, that never comes up, that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, which I think actually, in terms of things hidden, is an extraordinary thing for us to have missed. In terms of to what extent there's some psychoanalytic element of some recognition of this which is coming out, I don't know. I mean, I'd hesitate to go there, which is, I guess, what you do in terms of saying was psychoanalytic. It's all rubbish. I wouldn't know enough about it. I do think the fact that there's not been good and sensible discussion of this isn't a helpful thing, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised if, because we haven't had the conversations which needed to be had, we run into all sorts of problems around very confused understandings of human sexuality and all sorts of things. I think there is some link in terms of abuse of power, but I suppose that's where I would channel any discussion which would be happening around the significance of this to the clerical abuse scandal
It's to open up the notions of abuse of power, whether that's the abusive power of executioners or abusive powers of clergy in the church. And I think you'd have to add, at least my understanding of it is that the statistical incidence of clerical sexual abuse is more or less average for what you would expect it to be for men. So it's not to particularly scapegoat the clerical side of this, but I do think there is an issue of power and abuse there. Yeah.
I mean, it opens up a possibility, if you read it in a theological register, a much more sympathetic attitude towards the abusers, in the sense that if you read their conduct as theological, then that provides some avenue for thinking through, at least opening up that to try and see whether that. I mean, it's a fair point that you wouldn't. That statistically it's no more than average, except of course you'd expect it to be way less.
You might.
You'd expect it to be zero.
What do you mean by giving a theological justification for people who do that?
Allows you to meet them again.
Oh no, at some point I heard, I didn't hear you saying it allows you to meet them. I was more hearing you saying that it allows them to be a little less accountable.
No, it allows their conduct to be accountable in a totally different way.
I'm just wondering about how your paper and Paul's might go together in relation to the lynching, and you had said that most accounts of lynching do not really deal with the sexual violence, but my impression is that it in many ways was all about the jealousy of the white lynchers to the black man in relation to his virility and the white women, and that would be the sexual violence had to do with some jealousy or I guess no, it wouldn't be envy, I guess, or maybe it was.
Those things are very much there. I mean, I think there probably is, Paul's work on envy and jealousy probably would be very useful for opening up some of these lynching issues. I suppose just to clarify, I mean, what I mean by the sexual violence tends to get left out. It's there in the reports of it. I mean, this isn't new stuff. It is there, but in people's public awareness of lynching, you probably wouldn't pick out castration as a prevalent element of lynching, or most people wouldn't, I suspect. It's kind of left out of it. And
is it just because that we get our knowledge of lynching from popular culture, and popular culture can't really show, castration? Is that? I mean, that's the only way I know of lynchings, really. So.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, but it begs the question as well, I think it begs the question, but why, if something was so central to lynching as the sexual element was, and if sexual violence was so common, precisely because all these dynamics around sex and race were being played out. I mean, the conventional justification of lynching was the defense of the honor of the white woman against a sexual predatory African American man. I mean, that was the cloak of reason given to it. It ignores the facts that actually the rape of black women was far more common by white men than vice versa, but it was nonetheless the effective motivating agent that I think does help understand why there was this extraordinary violence directed against black men, and why it often did involve castration and mutilation and other forms of torture. And I'm sure part of that isn't just the belief that the black man had raped or might rape a white woman. It's to do with all sorts of jealousies and envies filtered through sex, race, class, and other things. And all of that, I would say, doesn't really get picked up in most analysis of lynching. It's a rather superficial sense of lynching that we get.
It has to do with not just race, but also masculinity. Like, we do not talk about male rape as what, you know, as much as we talk about female rape and that. So that this whole thing is taboo in our society for whatever reason.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, I think that sexual violence in general is taboo. Sexual violence in which men are victims is particularly a taboo. Sexual violence in which men are victims and also figures of religious reverence is just a huge taboo. I think when the BBC showed a programme in which they at least floated the idea that Jesus' birth was as a consequence of the rape of Mary by a Roman soldier, it was the programme which had had the most formal complaints up to that point in BBC history. And that was the rape, in some ways not wanting to normalise any of this, but in terms of what is seen as conventional, it was the rape of a woman, not the rape of a man. But because of the religious reverence to the people involved, it caused a huge level of protest against even making that suggestion. That they didn't say it had happened, they said some people believed it, that it happened.
It's good in the rather dark areas of human nature. I mean, the other theme that is sort of relevant here, potentially, we started off with the joke about cannibalism. And of course, there's a strong connection with cannibalism, you know, if you talk to some neuroscientists who explore the sort of drive system of humans, that it's not an established fact by any means, but it's a strong theoretical perspective, is that in terms of the sort of evolution of the drives, the sex drive is likely to have evolved out of a hunger drive. The first problem you need to solve is eating to keep your organism going, and reproduction is sort of contingent upon that. And in lots of animals, of course, the mating ritual is related to eating. And you know, so there's an interesting set of rather unpleasant connections that sort of emerge in particularly sort of these unpleasant circumstances where sexuality, cannibalism, and violence are a sort of very unholy trinity.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an area I'd even thought of, but it is very interesting to